It's a great pleasure to be here. And this little book, which says at the top that it's a manifesto, it comes out in a series called the Wiley Blackwell Manifestos. And I think the first thing I should say is that I never really knew what I was writing until I'd written it. His book has been inside me for a long time. I've had several. I was reading to my wife the other day a note from 2006 where I said, I'm about ready to finish this book. And I thought then, 16 years ago, that it would only be a short time before I could finish writing what I called a book on Islam Unbound. So this is really, in a sense, an extension of all my work to think about Islam unbound by territories, by ideologies, by local or even hemispheric histories. So in one sense, it's a comprehensive book, but it's not a book. It's more like a set of points that one can either refer to or connect in different ways. So even the cover was one where I had to think, what do I want to represent? Do I want to represent India, which in one sense I know best, or Southeast Asia, which I've also spent valuable time visiting and where my wife and I have taught back in 2006, or countries more central like Iran or Turkey or parts of the Maghreb or even Egypt. And finally, I decided, because Islamicate is a term that unbinds rather than rebinds the way one thinks about Islam and Muslim civilization over time, I thought to really instead use something from Al-Andalus, from southern Spain. So anybody who knows anything about Islamic Spain or Al-Andalus recognizes that this, of course, is the inside of the Mosque of Cordoba, and this is what I decided to put on the cover. But actually, I'm indebted to another less artistic but more historical reference from the Maghreb, a man named Ibn Khaldun and the Muqaddimah, which in one sense is, I think, the book that is not only, as it says here, an introduction to history, but it's an introduction to Islamicate cosmopolitan thinking. When I was myself a grad student, and I sympathize with all those, including Ehsan, who is a grad student still, I can remember thinking it was an endless toil. I'll never get through it, because one of the challenges that I had as a grad student was to read the Muqaddimah in Arabic with my teacher, a man named Franz Rosenthal, who was working on his own translation of the Muqaddimah. And I can say that I learned more from thinking about the translation than I did enjoy the class in translation itself, because it's such a large scope. The book itself undertakes much of prehistory, what people call the history before Islam, but without ever using the term Islamicate. Ibn Khaldun is writing, as Hodgson said, the first history of Islamicate civilization, because he's showing all the roots. They go back to the pre-modern world and go back to what people call the ancient world, not only to Greece and Rome, but also to ancient Egypt and Iran, in thinking about the strands that produce what is now known as Muslim, Islamic, or in my preference, Islamicate civilization. So this is the person who coined the term Islamicate. I like to have pictures of people, and I didn't realize until I had really almost written the book that there was actually somebody who didn't like Hodgson who described him better than some people who love him. So this is actually from Saul Bellow, who was very critical. They were both, of course, from Chicago. Hodgson taught there, and Saul Bellow lived and wrote there. But he apparently had a couple of encounters with Hodgson where he said he was always very studious, never informal. And Saul Bellow liked to be informal, off the cuff, casual, indulgent. And he said Hodgson was always the opposite. He was always this earnest, theoretical, high-minded, stubbornly virtuous. And I think I myself prefer the last qualification, that he was stubbornly virtuous. And so I have this picture of him, which shows a little bit of that characteristic of somebody who's very set on what he's going to say and looks a bit like he's stubbornly virtuous. And he produced this book in 3 volumes called The Venture of Islam. And I'm not going to talk too much about it because some of you don't have the images in front of you. Those of you who are online can see it all. But The Venture of Islam was really not something which Hodgson himself finished writing in his lifetime. He died in 1968, and this book didn't come out till 1974. but it's in 3 volumes because he taught it over 3 terms at Chicago. The first term was the classical age. The second was the middle period, which he preferred to the medieval. He called it the middle period instead of the medieval expanse or period of Islamic history. And then he did the fourth one, which is the Venture of Islam, volume 3, the Gunpowder Empires, which of course include the Ottoman, the Safavid, and the Mughal or Indo-Timurid empires, and then modern times. So to be able to share with you something which you can't see, but if you could imagine a map of the world that instead of privileging one part over the other, includes all of them in one space. And this is the one that I have on my screen now that comes not from me, but from Professor John Woods of the University of Chicago, who taught as I taught Hodgson for a number of years. And he always tried to be honest and to be reflective of Hodgson's choices. So he always started with a map, and then he shared this map with me, so I'm sharing it now with you, what he calls spheres of Islamicate studies. And he does not start with the Middle East, because Hodgson, for those of you who don't know, have never heard of him, he was rigorous about saying, if you're going to define something, make sure that it applies. If you're going to use a term, don't use it and then say, oh, by the way, I don't really mean the Middle East, I mean something else. So he never used the term Middle East, except to say that it's a wrong term to describe the place that is the center of Islamicate history. He used the term West Asia. And even now in some circles, you'll see these people say, well, really, instead of the Middle East, we should talk about West Asia. And the next day there's a report in the news that says, somebody said we should not use Middle East, instead West Asia. And of course they go on using Middle East. So like a lot of neologism, West Asia, which should be more accurate and is more accurate, is less frequently used in many circles than the Middle East. But Hodgson preferred Western Asia. And then he related all of the Est to the
Professor Lawrence, you are on mute.
the whole time?
No, I know, no. Just,
No. Just like a minute, 1 minute.
Just not one.
Is it okay now?
Yes.
So I'm just sort of briefly highlighting this map, which I'm not going to spend long on because some of you can't see it. But it begins with the middle point of Asia and then includes all of Africa, West Africa, North Africa, East Africa, and then the different parts of Asia, with Iran and Anatolia not mentioned as part of either Africa or Asia, but obviously bridging, as Iran does and Turkey does, bridging both Asia and Europe. And then Southeast Asia down in the corner. So these are trade circuits, and I'm not going to spend time on this because I'm trying to do an overview and not an in-depth history of the way in which Islam expanded. But trade and commerce and travel were integral. What Miriam Cook, my wife, and I have written about as Muslim networks were prevalent across the span of Africa, but of course the Mediterranean and also the Indian Ocean. In my book, I mentioned in a couple of places the scholar, also like Hodgson, a very brilliant scholar, but also like Hodgson, someone who died very young, Shahab Ahmed from Harvard, who wrote a book called What is Islam? The Importance of Being Islamic. And I quote him because I admire the strength of that book in its argument. At the same time, I criticize it for its narrow focus on just one period and one place. So the book came out in 2016. It's called What is Islam? I asked the rhetorical question, what is Islam? The Importance of Being Islamic. And in effect, in 3 parts and 6 chapters, so you can say my book is like his. I have 3 words in 6 chapters, but his book is 700 pages. Mine is less than 150 pages. But what Shahab Ahmed tries to do in his 3 parts and 6 chapters is to ask the question, what is Islam? And he uses the word pretext, which he uses inventively to mean not pretext in the sense of your excuse, but what comes before the text. What is the place, the setting, the context, which for him is the pretext for talking about what becomes scriptures, whether they're the Hebrew Bible, whether it's various Gnostic writings or the New Testament, or of course in time it's the Quran and many other texts that come out from Persian literature, of course, including the Shahnameh. So he talks about pretext and text and then the context in which each of these develops. But if there's one term to link to his book, What is Islam? It's the notion of coherent contradictions, that there are places like drinking wine and dancing and using art of various kinds that exist in parts of the Muslim world and are very strongly advanced in certain segments of Muslim history. But there are others who forbid these or avoid them and say you can't drink wine, you can't dance, you can't even recite poetry, you certainly can't draw pictures of the Prophet Muhammad or Ali or any of the companions or imams. But of course, in Iran and in the larger Persianate culture, art is possible, dance is welcome, music is used, and even drinking wine passes the test. So in the dedication of his book, Shahab Ahmed, who talks about coherent contradictions, dedicates it to my parents who raised me in the Islam of their cosmopolitanism and the cosmopolitanism of their Islam. I really think the dedication is the most artful and insightful part of the entire book, but it's also the part that's never explained. Because what he does there, which I also do in my book, is to link Islam and cosmopolitanism, but he never explains what's cosmopolitan about Islam or how Islam itself assists the notion of cosmopolitanism. And that's what I try and do in my book, is to put the two together and to talk about Islamicate Cosmopolitan and to talk about the two of them as spirit. So just to review what I've said very quickly and very briefly here, is I'm using time frames to talk about what Hodgson calls the Afro-Eurasian ecumene, or if you will, the whole civilized world from West Africa down to Southeast Asia and including many parts of Central Asia and China. Hodgson calls this Islamdom, this entire realm from Africa through the central Mediterranean lands, including Iran and Turkey, and to Central Asia and down to Southeast Asia. He calls this Islamdom, and he calls the outward trajectory of it Islamicate civilization. He starts before the birth of the Prophet Muhammad. He starts in 500 when the Byzantine and Sasanian empires are still very active, and shows how they continue to influence the development of a civilization that's named Islamic or Islamicate. And he stops in 1950 because he himself was aware of the fact that change had been drastic after World War II. And he talked about the advent of what he called the technical age, which now seems almost a euphemism because everything that we know about is technical. But Hodgson coined the term the technical age back before 1950 and shows how it traces itself in earlier parts of what become the modern world. Shahab Ahmed never talks about the modern world. He says that Islamic cosmopolitanism, or these coherent contradictions that make up the heart of what is Islam for him, start in 1300, which is really a very late date considering the important works, of course, of Ferdowsi, but Ibn Sina and Farabi and the whole host of magnificent people, including, of course, Ibn Arabi and as well the great Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi. All these people are before 1300, but he says no, the real heart and soul of Islamicate, or what he calls the Islamic cosmopolitan world, starts after 1300 and goes from the Balkans to Bengal. As I said, I think it's too narrow a time frame and too short and constricted a place of time, a place to illustrate the greater scope of Islam and Islamicate Cosmopolitan Spirit, which for me starts in 500. So I agree with Hodgson, and where I disagree with him is I try and go up to 2020, a little longer beyond the 20th into the 21st century. So here's the map that shows, if I can get it here, it just shows Iran, the Nile to Oxus, which is Hodgson's way of using two frames of water instead of land, showing the importance of the Nile River and the Oxus River as framing, of course, not only Arabia and Iran, but also extending up to the Black Sea and Turkey. And then that contrasts with what becomes for Shahab Ahmed, Balkans to Bengal, which is a longer trajectory, but it cuts out all of Arabia and North Africa, and of course does not extend down to Southeast Asia. So I think even in terms of a geographic framing, Balkans to Bengal is too narrow to include much of what is central to the longer trajectory of Islamic or Islamicate history. The most reductive of all, and I just put this on here without any name, is Clifford Geertz. And this shows my own bias, if you will, my own frame of reference, which is that I welcome anthropological insight, but not as historical data. So Geertz talks about this thing called Islam Observed, which one person reframed as Islam Absurd, because it talks about the different Islam that's in North Africa or Morocco, specifically with that which is in Java or Southeast Asia, but that includes nothing in between. It's interesting if you're going to make a contrast and call that a form of academic inquiry, but it is not adequate as a history, and it's not adequate as an inclusive view of Islam over time and place. So to sum up what I'm trying to say and give as much space as possible for Ehsan in his reflections on what I've said, you can say there are, and I say that there are some flaws in the third volume, the one that Hodgson never finished even in draft form, which was put together from his notes posthumously. He finished most of the actual editing as well as the production of volumes 1 and 2, the early periods and the middle periods, but the modern period required a couple years for one of his loyal associates, a man named Reuben Smith, to put together and publish as a third volume in what became the 3-volume Venture of Islam. But he does mention in that third volume something called the Great Western Transmutation, and he also mentions the high-tech era or period. And his point is not to say that Western transmutation means the West is the best, which his colleague William McNeil at Chicago wrote a book called The Rise of the West, which privileges the West. Hodgson said Western is not a descriptor, but instead has to be substantive and has to apply across time and space. I mentioned several people who do this. One of my favorites is one of Hodgson's last students, a Turkish economic historian actually named Huri Jahan Islamoglu. This is Huri at a conference in 2014. This is another, Wiley Blackwell doesn't pay me to advertise, but I have to advertise another of their volumes called the Wiley Blackwell Companion to World History, where Huri has an article, and so does Armando Salvatore have a volume called Wiley Blackwell History of Islam. Both of them contribute to a greater exposition of Hodgson. Huri talks about Hodgson's greatest contribution is transcending binaries of West and non-West. So there's not West and non-West, there's not a European center, non-European periphery, there's not a pre-modern and modern periodization. And there's, above all, two things that have to be challenged. First of all, is that Islam is only Arab. And you may say, well, I'm talking to a group that's a Persian association of scholars and interested parties, so I don't have to apologize for Islam being more than Arab. But you cannot imagine, or maybe many of you have experienced places where when you go in and say Islam, the very next word is Arab. And there still is an Arab or pro-Arab bias in many ways that people think about. I'm not denying that there's a strong and necessary Arab and Arabic component to Islam. But I agree with Hodgson that if you're going to do history, you have to see Persian and Persianate is there at the beginning. So he talks about Perso-Arabic, Irano-Semitic, the larger trajectory of Islamdom, which cuts across the center of Asia and includes beyond Islam, beyond Iran, points of reference that are not Western, and therefore there cannot be a Western bias either in thinking about Islam. So this, I've already mentioned what I've talked about here, different trajectories that are contingent and consequential for thinking about world history. A final map, I wanted to have one map, and I'm sorry not all of you are here, the people who are here can't quite see the map, but it's a map that really goes from Senegal all the way to Southeast Asia, Senegal to Sumatra, if you will, and shows how the larger shadow, the larger arc of influence for Islam goes across not only North Africa, much of West and East Africa, and especially coastal Africa, including part of Madagascar, and then all the way out to Southeast Asia. And these had all become part of, whenever everybody says to me, so how do you want to emphasize that Islam is Asia? I say, I always want to look at the Sultanate of Manila. Manila, but that's Catholic. Yes, it's Catholic, but it has not always been Catholic. There was once a Muslim Sultanate of Manila. And so even the name the Philippines comes from King Philip of Spain. And it was not always the Philippines, and it was often also part of the larger arc of Islam in Asia. So the summary of all that I want to say, just to conclude, is that Hodgson has been and can be and should be criticized as emphasizing the elites, because he's looking at the tangible evidence we have of history, and a lot of that's literary, and literature is mostly produced by people who can read and write and also have the means of production for perpetuating what they read and write. So it's not that non-elites don't matter, but elites dominate, and you have to figure out how they dominate. And for Hodgson, what is really brilliant about his approach is he uses many of the great names of Islamic scholarship, but he puts them in conversation with bureaucrats and with lawyers and merchants. So it's not only scholars, it's scholars as part of a larger society. And he emphasizes empires, not to say that all empires are good or that empires don't have their own flaws, but notices that ideas of statecraft, especially those that come out from the Persianate world, are important for describing Muslim majority empires across the larger streams of world history. And finally, without emphasizing that the West is the modern reciprocal, or the modern vehicle rather, for the reciprocal identity of modern and pre-modern, he notes that modern matters, but it doesn't matter only in the West or only in Europe or only in America. It also matters in Africa and Asia, and includes as much Islamicate as it does non-Muslim vectors of interest. And so what I try and do in my own work is to say there are these Islamicate or Persianate trajectories that go out to the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. There are also those who look for a fresh moral vision, and that is Islamicate Cosmopolis with a Persianate subtext. And there's also an Islamicate spirit. So I wanted to just end what I had to say with one example that, since it's a gathering of people who are very familiar with, or would even privilege a Persian or Persianate view, one of the strange things about this book is that Ehsan liked it. No, I actually am very happy he liked it. But what's even stranger than Ehsan liking it is that a guy named Nardan Adalan liked it. And I was in conversation with Nader Adlan. For those who don't know him, he's an architect, Persian, Iranian American architect who's taught at MIT and Harvard. And he liked the book, and we had a conversation in April. This is how he looks. He's actually a very gentle man, but this is a very kind of stern look that he had the day that this picture was taken. And we talked about a lot of things. And in effect, what he said, which I find very helpful, is he said that in effect, if you engage in major projects and you assess the works of others, as he's done in the Committee for the Aga Khan Awards in Architecture, you have to recognize that Barzakh logic, which is a word I use throughout my book, is itself a counterpart to the super circle or the super ellipse, which was a circle square design that is elaborated by the Danish philosopher Piet Hein. And Ardlan, when he and I had a long conversation back in April, said that he found the super ellipse was an example of Barzakh logic outside the Islamicate world, but with implications for, among other things, contemporary Islamic architecture, and for him, the redesign of the mausoleum of Shamsi Tabriz in Khoi. And for those of you who want to look about more of this, it's a whole hour and 15 minutes on a YouTube presentation, and you can see how he talks through all these different categories. This is Nader Adalan in applying Barzakh logic and the super circle and rethinking the Shamsi Tabriz design he did for Khoi Iran. So just to end this, this is even something that Ehsan has not seen. It's such a crucial element, and it's so simple to explain. Everybody knows what a square looks like. Everybody's seen a circle. But it's only a few people who've reflected how a square and a circle come together in something that is a super circle that in effect has two centers. It has a center on either side, and neither one can collapse into the other for it to retain its function or its form as a super circle. So what he has found useful, that is Nader Adalan, is the super circle, like Barzakh logic, includes the material and the spiritual, but they are contiguous without collapsing one into the other. And that's the benefit, which is also the beauty, of course, of the super circle and Barzakh logic, is it shows that different or contraries, what Shahab Ahmed would call contrary, can be not only coherent, but they can be coadjacent or contiguous with one another without collapsing into each other. And so this is what he's trying to do for those of you who are interested in Iran, especially in Hoi and what's going on there. In this long-term project, which he describes at length in the video that's on YouTube, this is the current day site of Hoi, and the Shamsi Tabrizi mausoleum is there. And this is what he hopes to have replace it if the oil embargo is lifted and Iranian cultural ventures that were put forward and had to be stopped in 2018 can be resumed once we have a future that allows the development of such marvels as this new museum, which Nadal wants to put in Hoi, Iran. So thank you very much. That's my presentation, and I look forward to having myself as well as you illuminated by what Ehsan will say.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you very much. All right, let me see if I can pin myself here. Okay. Let's see. No, I think that should be okay if we can just do.
You want to go back?
Yes. I just
There we
want
are.
to, yeah, pin this one maybe. Stop video pin maybe.
Ask to unmute.
Ehsan Can, do you want to stop the presentation?
Yeah, I can stop the presentation, sure.
Is that okay?
With that, here you go.
Okay. Thank you. So wonderful. Okay, thank you so much, Professor Lawrence.
You're welcome.
Okay, many people have introduced the book, so I'm not in the position even to start with, but what I'm trying to do is to give you some more space for more conversations that
Sure.
we have. And I want to start with this very charming story that how this book started, that you mentioned your colleague in the University of, in UK, in Exeter University.
Yes.
A quote from your colleagues that says, "You have made our lunch hour into 2 hours." He joked, adding, "You have reflected on all options and argued for a new tongue twister, Islamicate Cosmopolitan. But do you really feel that this phrase is an epistemic term worth pursuing?" And with that, the project kind of, the urge to write this book and put it out started, which is amazing and wonderful. Then you go on in a very wonderful way, structuring the book, thinking about defining each individual term. What do we mean by Islamicate? Why it is still important? You mentioned that in the time of 1960s, the reason that Hudson wanted to do this was against certain politics, imperialism, certain
Called the Vietnam War.
etc., etc. And you mentioned series of, and the wonderful, I just wanted to read the list of interlocutors in this book, and it kind of has this spirit of cosmopolitanism. You have interlocutors from Habermas, Derrida, Alain Badiou.
Derrida, don't forget Walter Mignolo also. Walter Mignolo.
Mignolo, Ulrich Beck, to people like Homi Bhabha, Chakrabarti, Niles Green, and then Karim Karim, Puro Islamoglu, as we mentioned, Hassan Fatih, Abbas Amanat, Asif Bayat, all the way, again, Nisiblu from Harvard Art History, of course, Professor Miriam Cook, who is we're kind to be here in the room also, and of course, Shahab Ahmed. One of the figures that is interesting in this series of figures is also Ahmed Kara Mustafa. And what I'm trying to get out of this series of conversation about how to define Islamicate, how to define cosmopolitanism, and what is the spirit, is the question of civilization. You have a very interesting ambivalent relationship to civilization. On the one hand, you criticize it for being elitist, for being about few people who push the boundaries in certain ways. And at the same time, as Kara Mustafa would say, this unfolding thing that has no boundaries and constantly pushes the boundaries. You also make this distinction between civilization and culture, not only in its scale, but in its ontology, in its capacities to push boundaries. As Regis Sobere also says, culture is defensive, civilization is offensive. It goes out, creates bridges, creates roads, versus culture wants to protect itself constantly. And it's local, versus civilization is not local. So I'm wondering what is your, and then beautifully you get to the really question of the relevance of what you're doing to contemporary world, to the question of nation states and identity of nation state, right? We have this idea of, okay, Persianate Islamicate civilizational forces or capacities, as you talk about, their epistemologies, but also their cultural values, their adapt, their larger scientific, humanist even capacities, but at the same time political. So I'm really interested in seeing how you would describe the tension between civilization and nation states. How to situate nation state politics in the politics of Islamicate cosmopolitanism. Because interestingly enough, if I may kind of elongate my already long comment on our lunch conversation some months ago, you highlighted this part of the book for me. You mentioned, quote, here lies a tension between the verticality of the cosmos and the horizontal rootedness of the polis. It is a tension to be explored below, but one should underscore that civility requires belonging to some polis or city place, and without that belonging, there could not be longing to make the world the larger, indeed the largest place of belonging. So you already are talking about this tension between belonging to a place and longing for this infinite, as it's better, or ecumen, as you described it. So I'm wondering, and we have so many bad returns to national myths, right? I mean, we as Persians are particularly good at that, to kind of go back constantly to this idea of civilizational superiority and some sort of, ideas about, Persians, this. But at the same time, when it comes and conflates with nationalism, it can become really not so great.
Of course not.
As you would accept. So I'm wondering how you, how to reconcile this tension between cosmos as cosmopolis, and as Professor Mariam Cook has mentioned, this idea of cosmopolis, citizen of the world, but also citizen of a locus, how this tension works. If I formulated the question.
No, you formulated the question very well, and I'm aware of the fact that among the people who tuned in to listen to this is Walter Mignolo, to whom I'm indebted for many things, but including his description in his most recent book about the ambivalences of Stephen Toulmin in his book on cosmopolitan modernity, which, if one applies it, and I don't have time to apply all of Toulmin's insights or Walter's elaboration of those insights and his own thoughts about Cosmopolis, but if one takes the polis, as Toulmin does, to have been superseded by the nation state, then it is poisoned forever. And so in one sense, my effort is a recuperative effort to say, is there such a thing as a cosmopolis, which is obviously taken, in my view, a negative turn, not only the colonial logic about which Professor Mignolo has talked at length, but also the ethnic and linguistic twist towards a self-identity that shuts out rather than includes others, or claims to include others as make-believes or secondary citizens to your own superiority. So the whole nation-state ethos, which I oppose, and which at different points in the book I talk about as not ambiguous or ambivalent, but as simply disastrous and calamitous for many peoples. And I'm trying to recuperate civilization, even though there is also a lot of pushback against civilization as itself narrowing and always privileging a hierarchy. And again, I can cite the number of books and one of the people who have written about the fact that Toynbee has poisoned civilization almost as much as Huntington, because he's delimited, this is Arnold Toynbee, all the major civilizations of the world in order to show that Western civilization is the best.
Yes.
And so it's sensitive. There's a kind of reflexive privileging of oneself in what claims to be academic and neutral, or at least inclusive scholarship. It's wrong. And so I come back, and this is where I think one of the most radical points I make in the book, and I probably should have written it even in capital letters, the civilization does not start with Toynbee. It does not even start with the Greeks. It's elaborated in the way in which I think of it for this book by Ibn Khaldun. And really, in one sense, it's not that Qumran is a translation of civilization, it's a civilization as a translation of Qumran. So if one starts to privilege one language, say, oh, it's civilization, it goes back to Greek and it goes back to Cosmopolis, and you can't get out of the ethno-linguistic web, which is suffocating rather than enabling a kind of broader worldview. My view, and what I stated in the chapter there where I mentioned Ibn Khaldun, is that he not only says there is a larger category of the civilized world, but for him it's a world that's occupied by people, which includes Bedouins, nomads, who are not usually civilized. So the very notion that there's an Umran Badawi, as well as an Umran Hadar, and that these two interrelate to each other, that one can't exclude the other without both losing. So there's one sense in which all that Miriam and I both have written about and talked about and tried to explain as Barzakh logic. Barzakh logic, that is to say, having two things that are really antithetical and in one sense oppositional to each other, but also in need each of the other. That kind of formation of a duality that is not competitively nihilistic, but cooperatively expansive, that really comes up in Ibn Khaldun. And so in one sense, it's not fair to say that he's the father of civilization studies, as far as say civilization is the heir of Qumran studies. So in that sense, I try and get beyond the divide of culture. And I never use the term thaqafa. I never, although it's there, and it obviously is in Arabic, and there's a larger sense of culture in Iran as well. And culture, for me, culture always is relating to a place, to a literature, to a history that narrows rather than expands. Even though it's a necessary part of the polis, it's not the part that is the outer boundary, it's the part that's the inner reflex. So I try and bring those two things together. And I think what, to me, rescues some of these complicated and potentially poisonous terms is what I describe. And you asked me about this earlier, and I've been asked about this in many of my talks, is what is logical about Barzakh. And so the answer is you can't explain it, but you can see it. This is why I'm so fascinated with Nader Adlan and his interest in architecture, is that somehow the circle, the Piet Hein super ellipse, is something you can see and you can spot it and you can say, this is where it works. There are two centers that you could in one sense say are competing, but when they work together, they become something greater. And I think that is really what the Barzakh is in terms of the Quran, which is where I started from. It's where it comes from as a term, but it's both epistemological, it is as well epistemically verifiable, and it is also cosmology of thinking of worlds, this world and another world, and it's existential. It's something that can be experienced. So it has many different registers, and it's the core of what I try and do in the book.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. The book have multiple interventions, I would say, on multiple levels. One that you're calling for, along with other people, on a revisionist history, of revisionist, not history of Islam, world history.
Yeah.
And that's an amazing call to position. And it's interesting that you, again, going back to the question of civilization, you say there's one civilization and Islam is part of it. That's one way of
There's one global civilization.
One global civilization, Islam is part of it. And then inside that, you want to say we need to have a reconfiguration or reorientation of thinking about history. And it's amazing that you show those maps, because you can tilt the entire world map and create an axis that's perpendicular as opposed to keep the map that direction. You can't even turn the map and say, well, let's look at the world in this way, as people did. You know, they turned the South America on its head and say, let's now look at it in this way, right?
Well, actually, Walter Mignolo, if he's still online, is one of the people who has turned that map on its head and said, if you look at it from within South America, it's not South America, it's the center of America, and then the other parts relate to it. I try and do this, and one of my least satisfactory outcomes in this book, although I try and correct what others have done, I don't think I do an adequate correction myself, is not to put Southeast Asia on the fringe. And it's so difficult because every single map has a center, and the center goes towards Africa and Asia. And then you go out to the periphery and maybe you see America out there, and maybe you see Southeast Asia, East Asia. But every map, even when China is the center, Southeast Asia is off to the one side. And yet, in terms of the Muslim world, in many, many parts of its indices for a broadly diverse and inclusive trajectory in world history, Southeast Asia is not this periphery, it's the center. It's the centerpiece, at least, of what could be a remodeling of world history.
Wonderful. So one is this level of intervention in world history. Another intervention is revisionist vocabulary, which is another amazing thing that the book is doing.
Yeah.
So you have interlocutors that say, well, why if I'm pronouncing her name right, the head of the Aga Khan architecture program at Harvard, Nishipulu.
Oh, Nishipulu. Oh, yeah, she's the head of the architect. Nishipulu, great.
And also the head of the MIT program, Nasser Abad, both still lean toward the term Islamic, whereas you are explaining, and Shahab Ahmed as well, you are explaining why we should have this revisionist terminology, why it is important to use Islamic.
Yeah, the person I want to bring into the conversation is Wendy Shaw, whose father, Stanford Shaw, was a really important Ottomanist in his generation. And Wendy Shaw wrote this book, which I think I cite 3 or 4 times. What is Islamic art? And she puts Islamic in quotation marks because she, in effect, argues against Nishipulu from Harvard and against the Rabat and against a host of others, saying there's no Islamic art because there's no Christian art.
Yes, exactly.
There's Western art, which subsumes a Christian subset. So if we're not going to talk about Eastern art, which is a ridiculous concept, or Western art, how do you resonate something which has all these motifs that are relating to form, but color and designs and choices in both art and architecture, ceramics and calligraphy that we call Islamic art? But it's really Islamicate because it has Chinese influences, it has Mongol influence, it has pre-Islamic Iranian influences. So the term Persianate, which we haven't got to yet. The reason why we have both Islamicate and Persianate is it shows an expansion that is chronologically prior as well as beyond the limits of either Persian or Islamic.
So wonderful. The third one intervention that we have, so revisionist history, revisionist vocabulary, new methodology. And this new methodology, which the vehicle for that is this concept of barzakh that you formulate, or in-betweenness. Put it simply. At the same time, I found it interesting because barzakh, in perhaps the collective consciousness of Iranians somehow, is a place that you don't want to be in. You want to get out of it, right? Send me to a damn hell, but not keep me in barzakh, please. Okay, so now the question is, and Darius Shaikan talks about this. He talks about apprivoiser culturel, meaning taming of cultures. He says, well, you have this moment of in-betweenness when cultures still are trying to, civilization are still trying to intermingle. But when it settles down somehow, it creates, and you use the term mosaic. And talks about minority and the problem of not, as it were, kind of like integrated kind of cultures that remain mosaics, and then at the moments of nationalism, they emerge at separatist cultural claims and communitarianism. So I'm wondering how can we work with this kind of not tamed condition of Barzakh that one wants to get out of, as it were, in terms of methodology, because it's so amazing in terms of methodology when you think about that. How a methodology that's supposed to be stable is the thing that is on fire, as it were. You are kind of in tension. And it's a kind of driving motor, because if you're in tension, as you mentioned, you can pull things and you can create new knowledge through that tension precisely. But does that tension need to eventually calm down and kind of,
Does it need to calm down? I'm not sure it can calm down. I mean, you praise it because it's an interesting emotive question. Miriam Cook, my wife, and I have I spent many mornings and sometimes lunches and dinners and in between times talking about this in between concept, Barzakh, because in one sense, everyone wants to reduce it back to its Quranic references, but the Quranic references themselves are multiple.
Mm-hmm.
So the one that's taken hold that many people think, oh, this is the simplest one. Barzakh is between heaven and hell. Is between this life and the life beyond. It's like purgatory.
Yes.
Oh yes, it's just another Catholic term that we can find in the Quran. But actually, I think the subtlety about Barzakh and what to me makes it a movable, but I hope not a kind of exhaustive or exhausting concept, is that there's always a point of stability where there is a temporary moment of reflection, even when the boundaries themselves begin to change and move elsewhere. So I think it is it's more like a snapshot. So it's the image in the mirror, and the image can change, but the mirror remains. So I think Barzakh is more like the mirror, where you have different images that come and go, but the mirror itself remains as a kind of repository. And the reason I use that image so strongly is because when we were first thinking about this some years ago now, and we were talking about the sea and fresh water, I was always thinking in terms of Mediterranean, the Nile coming in the Mediterranean, and this one is fresh and the other is salt. But Miriam reminded me that when we were in Arabia, especially when we're in Qatar, looking at the shore there, you can see camels come up and they stick their noses under the water. They're not drinking the salt water, they're going beneath the sand to drink the fresh water underneath it. So there's actually salt and fresh water that are only separated by a surface.
Oh, wonderful.
So it's always in movement, but it's always also framed as separate, because if one intermingles with the other, both are lost. And I think this is the thing to me, is at the heart of Barzakh is to be in transition without always being in turmoil.
Wonderful. So in a way, one might think, and you mentioned that Khaldun is a science of history. One major other science of history might be Hegelian history, through dialectics. And the dialectics also keeps, maybe not, right? Okay, so probably we shouldn't go along that.
So you want me to comment on why it's not Hegelian history?
No, I'm just wondering, because and you use the term spirit, right?
Yeah, I know, which invites a Hegelian riposte. Yeah.
And you're talking about this tension of synthesis that is not creating that. Yeah. But for Hegel, synthesis is not synthesis either. Like, he talks about thesis and this antithesis is somehow internal, the kind of internal contradiction of thesis that kind of creates the motor for history to moving forward. But the problem with Hegel is that he has telos and it moves toward an absolute spirit. But I think you are saying that it's constantly, as it were, has a grain in the system that
yeah, if I had to pick between a teleological and cyclical, I would say that I lean much more, and I think Barzakh logic leans much more to a cyclical or recurrent.
Excellent.
It's not saying that everything returns to where it was at the beginning, but there are certain recurrent patterns, rather than there's a simple telos, which is an advance of either civilization or disaster towards either apocalypse or utopia. Yeah. I don't think either one is the outcome of history.
Is that what you would? No, please. I mean, we eventually will open it to discussion. So why not now that okay, so it wouldn't harass you more than that. Let's get to the question of Persianate, because I think many of our audience would be interested in hearing about that. But I'm interested in one thing that you mentioned, that you refer to Persianate as part of Islamic culture, and at points you also kind of complicate that thesis that, you know, like it is, yes, part of that Islamicate notion, but because you have already opened Islamicate in time, place, and on metaphysical horizon, then Persianate also can be opened up in terms of pre-Islamic kind of history that comes into it, right? So it is interesting to think of the larger category that you mentioned, Islamicate, and Persianate is one modality of Islamicate, which is an interesting. Can you clarify that?
It's a modality, but it's also a precursor. I mean, when I read Hassan, I've read him and taught him now for, you know, over 4 decades. One of the things that's very clear is when he's talking, and you're going back to your notion about revisionist terminology, he realizes that he has 2 enemies, and he wants to fight these enemies at the same time. One is the West, the idea of Western triumphalism or superiority, and the other is kind of Arab inherent hegemony over everything else that's Muslim. So it's both Arab hegemony and Western triumphalism that are his twin bête noirs, enemies, what he's leaning against. When he's doing the whole history of the origins of Islam, the development of Islam, he really moves very quickly into the fact that there is not a literate culture that develops around Islamic sciences that are not influenced by Persian. And he means it in 2 ways. And one of the things that's I've read, and I don't see anybody else before Hodgson did, he says, Persian is not only a language, it's also a disposition. And so it's interesting that the earliest people who write about Islamic history are Persian. Tabari, Persian, and Razi, other people who are not considered to be, in fact, the number of people I run into who when I mention the name Tabari, they say, well, of course he's an Arab. No, he used Arabic. He's fluent in Arabic. Even the beginning of Arabic grammar started from a Persian writer, not an Arab writer. So Ibn Khaldun, when he's doing this, he says, if you think about civilization, we didn't have civilization without the Persians. So there's no Islamicate without a Persianate.
At the same time,
Persianate becomes
a modality of
Islamicate.
Persianate is itself a subset of Islamicate. The 2 neologisms are linked by a broadly revisionist project of seeing Islam as a part of world history.
So there's 2 things. There is the historical gradient, or the temporal grade, which is the Persianate comes before Islamicate. Without the Persianate, there would not be an Islam, because Persian is the first next element that frames what Hodgson says is there in the pre-modern period as Irano-Semitic. There was always Iran that was different from Egypt or Greece or any of the other. There's always an independent Iranian subset of global culture. But then when you get something that becomes a civilization, which is expansive borders where you claim to have all the central parts of civilization, Persian is there with Arab. And Perso-Arabic becomes the core of what is Islamicate civilization. So without the Perso element, there would not be Perso-Arab, and there would not be Islamicate. But Persianate, and what I developed in the latter part of that, Persianate develops separate from Islamicate. Because so that, for instance, in India, you say, oh, there he goes to India again. But
no. Actually, that was my next question. So please, yes.
Well, should I wait to your question?
No.
So my answer is, if one goes to India, one sees Brahmins, people are Hindus, the highest class of Hindus, but they speak Persian because Persian is the refined language of their everyday discourse. So you don't have a link of Islam or Islamic identity. And some people say, oh, but it happens under Mughal rule. So in one sense, Chandrapan Brahman was one of the most interesting people under the reign of Shah Jahan. And the whole book by Rajiv Kumar Rajiv Kinra from Northwestern has written about him. He is a very devout Hindu, but he works under Moghul emperor and he writes poetry in Persian. So in one sense, he's a product of an Islamicate worldview, but his cultural mainstream is Persian, and therefore he's an example also of Persianate world. So the two go together.
Wonderful. Okay, last, before we open up to questions, if I may. Am I? Sorry. So one of the questions that is very interesting to end with is the idea of decline.
Well, that itself is one of the things that Hodgson was very, very intent upon correcting, and what I try to correct also. I won't be much longer. My wife is more eager than I am to see this come to a really, not a decline, but
And sorry, yes, no, yeah.
So decline is not something that can be understood except in relative terms. And there is no real decline of the Muslim world. There's a decline of different parts of the world relative to the rise of the West, which is not a decline so much as it is a recalibration. So that's my simple answer to a not so simple question.
Yes. Okay, so shall we open up to the questions?
Yeah, and I'm going to take just a quick break for 1 minute.
Sure. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming, and I wish we later next time we'll talk about Hegelian philosophy. Okay.
So we could open up the questions at least to you.
First to the room and then to audience, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay. I will moderate the questions if I may.
Yes, sure.
And if anybody have questions, please. Yes, that would be wonderful. I will read the questions, and I will start with the room as well. So let me see if I can get this one. Okay, wonderful. All right, this is good. 1 second, and I will start with questions. All right.
So I have one question.
Sure.
Someone stamped the word Persianate. When and who was the person? Maybe Professor Lawrence would know.
I will. Okay.
And also, the word Persianate comes from Persian, and Persian itself comes from Pars. So, to Professor Lawrence's support, yes, the Persianate goes back before the Islam, right? Because Pars existed about 1,000 years at least before Arab's conquest of Persia. So the question and comment. One is, who stamped the word Persianate? Someone probably stamped that. Maybe someone could check online.
Who came?
Who stamped the word
Coined
Persianate?
it?
Oh, they call on the front of Shahab Ahmed.
Oh, okay.
You mean on the stamp?
Yeah, who started the word Persianate or this first?
No, the word Persianate came from Hodgson.
Hodgson already. Yeah.
Oh,
Hodgson originated both these terms.
Islamicate and Persian.
No, but what's so interesting, and the reason I was so pleased with Ehsan's question was that there are two different senses of it. There's when did it begin, and when was it applied? So that Hodgson really first thought of the term Persianate because he wanted to talk with the broader, and he compared it with Italianate. He says so in the very beginning of it. He says, "Oh, by the way, everyone knows about Italian. I was talking with a friend of mine who said, I read your book and I don't understand this term Persian. I said, how about Italian? Oh, he said, it's like Italianate. I mean, you can like you can like Venetian blinds without being from Venice. He kind of got it as soon as I said, yeah, that's Persianate. You can like arches and you can like beautiful calligraphy and you can like turquoise birds without being Persian. So that's Persianate. So that's actually easy. But Islamicate, you mean you can be like a Muslim without being a Muslim? I said, no. But you can go to the Santa Barbara post office. And this guy knows about the West Coast. I don't know, have you ever been to the West Coast? Santa Barbara post office. And he says, yeah, it looks really foreign. I said, no, it's Islamicate. It comes from Andalusia. It was brought over by the monks who settled that part of California because after the Reconquista and they kicked out the Muslims, they kept their art. So there's Islamicate art. It's not Persianate art. It's Islamicate art because it shows the influence of all the Muslims who for centuries, 800 years, ruled southern Spain. The other word that people like is Morisco. But I try and I have a whole chapter in the book there where I say, correct. The problem with the term Morisco is implies people who are secretly Muslim. Actually, some of these people were not secretly Muslim. They had become something else, but they had influences of Islam. So they're Islamicate Spanish. So Islamicate very much applies in terms of Spain. It's where you can see the clearest difference between Islamicate and Persianate is in Spain and Santa Barbara. But Persianate, the Eastern world, I would say going from the Nile East, Persianate is starting. From the Nile West, it's a different kind of culture that becomes incorporated after 800 years in Spain as Islamicate.
Right. So in support of your comments about Persianate, that came from Persian, the word Persian, and of course, before the Islamic, before the Arabs' conquest of Persia, right?
The whole Sasanian period. One of the most interesting things about what's happening now is in Europe, not so much in America or in Canada, but in Europe, there's a lot more work on chanceries and the kind of labor that goes on in bureaucracies, chanceries and bureaucracies and epistolary. And this guy, by the way, Chandra van Brahman, the guy I was mentioning from India in the 17th century time of Shah Jahan, he was not a courtier. He was a person who was a clerk, a high-level clerk. But the whole way in which Persian, going back to the Sasanian period, it takes a different mode when it's under Islamic rule, and there are Islamic rulers who are also Persian. But the whole idea of organizing a sustained empire is Sasanian remodeled as Islamicate in various parts, all the way out to the Sultanate of Manila. All these forms of architecture and art and bureaucracy have a definite stamp, if you want to use that image. It goes back to pre-Islamic. The part of this book where somebody really tried to attack me was said, how can you call something Islamic before Islam? I said, because what's Sasanian becomes Islamic in the first century of Islam. So it's Persianate. In the truest sense, it's Persianate across time. So Persianate predates Islam
and then becomes
part of Islam. I think that's probably I hadn't thought of it till just now, but I think that's a clear. Persianate is there along with Italianate. Italianate is there long before modern vineyards, but there's Italian grapes that we know about through centuries. So there's Italianate that goes across centuries. The Persian, and it doesn't start with Islam. It takes a different modality, a different form, and different influences with Islam. So Persianate pre-exists Islam and succeeds in concert with and beyond Islam. Yeah.
Okay. John, please introduce yourself so our audience know that you are who you are, please. Yes.
John Miller, current graduate student at UNC.
A little louder, please.
Oh, they don't care.
No, they
okay. In any case, I have been a big fan of Shahab Ahmed's work, but I think your critiques are well taken. I was thinking about the notion of discursive traditions too, and whether you think from Blasi, of course, whether you think that sort of lens at looking at the development and unfolding of Islamic spaces and communities is in tension with your project, or something that could be subsumed and complement this sort of this Islamicate Cosmopolitan framework?
So what is in contradiction with it from Shahab Ahmed? What is a part of Shahab Ahmed you want to retrieve?
Oh no, I don't think there's. I think no, what you've said is. I agree that it's in its limitations that you've pointed to, both geographic and temporal. I think it may be as well sort of far removed from everyday like lived experiences of Muslims. The idea of the hermeneutic encounter with pretext is sort of a little bit more highbrow than. So I'm in agreement with you that I think that's a fair critique to raise, that it's maybe under-inclusive as a sort of analytic lens.
Except the one analytic point that he makes, which I affirm and think he should have and could have, and maybe had he lived, he would have developed further, is that there are inherent contradictions in different forms of Islamic identity, if you want to put it that way, discourse and then identity and perform. I put a big stress here in performance. It's not only what you say and believe, it's what you do. And so and he is extremely strong in identifying the period he knows so well, which is whole library, which by the way is here in the triangle area now. You know that Widener did not take his library for some. Well, the same reason they didn't take him for tenure. You know, he never got tenure at Harvard. He was going to spend his last year at MIT, and then he died. And the book was published almost posthumously. But his whole library is here between Duke and UNC. And all of it's between 1300 and 1850. So really, he's writing out of his library. He identifies something which is very important, coherent contradiction. And I think this phrase, which he did not invent, actually it goes back to Hafiz, the madhab-e-ishq, is a really valuable way of thinking. The law it's almost a term of Barzakh logic. I hadn't thought of it till now, but the idea that you have madhab, which is a juridical term that applies to schools of law, and everybody knows it. But then there's a madhab that you can't quite describe as juridical, that you don't want to say it's outside the law. So it's a different kind of law. What is it? Oh yeah, it's that thing called madhab-e-ishq. So you make in ishq, which is outside the law, a part of law, but it can never be completely identified with it. So the term itself illustrates the problem, that it's a coherent contradiction. So I hope I haven't too much detracted from Shahab Ahmed's contribution, because I think raising the question, and of course, who would not love the playful way in which he uses what is Islamic as a way of bring himself into identity with modern British culture.
Okay, may I take
So I have one more question, if you don't have any.
No, you're interested in architecture. I hope you appreciated the architecture references, because I think architecture, one of the things that I say in my book and say repeatedly, is that architecture is the most understudied form. It's illustrated. Everybody illustrates, it says these wonderful buildings. Oh yes, I've been to that post office in Santa Barbara. But they all think the buildings, but they don't see the buildings as itself reflective of deeper cultural intimations and also integrations of different viewpoints.
I'm kind of interested in where some of the features of the architecture came from. People have postulated that the onion dome, for instance, which is not really Persian, I think the more Islamic, just from what I see, but based on the design of the Bath of Europe, for instance. Then I see something like the Mughal miniatures and their similarity to Persian miniatures. I assume the Mughals were influenced by the Persians. I'm not in the background. I'm not, excuse me, my interest in all this stuff. This is not academic, it's just personal. So
that's healthy.
A little out of my league question here, but I'm very interested in the dynasties and the Sassanians. So someday I'll put it all together and I'll have a really good overview of it, but I'm still learning. That's why I'm here to learn more. I've written down some terms that I'm not as familiar with as I should be, and I'm going to educate myself a little bit at right here. I've been wanting to attend something like this ever since COVID hit. I can't tell you how many things I've missed since then. I discussion. here.
Well, listen, if you're writing down terms, I can't read your list because it's too far away. No, but and you don't need to read it out loud. But I would say of all the critical terms, and it came up when Ehsan introduced me, the one critical term that really extends beyond anything I've said, and which multiple things have written, is the word adab.
I've done
A-D-A-B. If you think about the multiple ways in which adab is used, it's both literature, but art, and ethics. And I especially stress the ethics part of it. That if you don't have an ethical notion that goes beyond akhlaq is a technical word for ethics as decided in law, as a public moral code. Adab is an internal code, not a public one. It's something you feel and express and perform.
Embody. Yeah.
Embody. It's embodied beauty rather than just a pretty picture. So adab, if I had to pick one word out of there, 4 letters out of my whole book, would be A-D-A-B, adab.
Well, there's also Barzakh.
No, Barzakh is crucial, but there's too many letters.
I'll just break it to you. I'm serious. I'm very grateful to be here to listen
Thank
to
you.
Well, thank you.
Okay.
It justifies coming out.
May I take a question from
Audience.
audience here? Mr. Mehran Divan Baizagar. Sorry for my bad pronunciation of your name. I apologize. I promised to read the question better. How would this reorientation with the introduction of Islamicate be not limited to academic circles and maybe transform institutions or become more institutionally relevant?
Well, I think this is the book I haven't written, because Islamicate is a tough word. Let me just tell you that when and Ehsan wouldn't mind my telling a joke on him when he said, "I'm going to make a commentary on your book afterwards on Islamic Cosmopolitan Spirit." I said, no, you have to add one more syllable, Islamicate. So even
No, that was the Freudian slip.
see the Freudian slip. So even my
Yeah,
my good friend Ehsan has a trouble adding that extra syllable,
that was
Islamicate.
complete Freudian.
But you know, going back to Hassan and going back to revisionism, and actually Walter Mignolo, who is still hanging there with us, Walter has introduced in his own the term decoloniality, which existed before him, but it now cannot be talked about without reference to the works and the insights of Walter Mignolo. So there's the same sense in which I'm trying to say Islamicate was there from Hassan and Hassan developed. But one of my close friends who's at the University of Chicago said, you know, we're really grateful for your book because now people who can't read the 3 volumes can read your book and understand what Islamicate is. So there's a certain sense in which you really have to have a primer before you can get into the advanced labor. So what I tried to do in this book was to make a primer for Islamicate, to say there are other words you can use to talk about Muslim, Islamic, generic interests across time and place, Persianate, obviously. But there's a certain sense in which Islamicate, because it adds an extra suffix, creates an expanse that allows religious, but also cultural, allows social and economic, but also artistic and ethical expressions. And so Islamicate, I think of as a kind of umbrella, an umbrella concept that allows one to think, if one wants to think about religious or theoretical or philosophical terms, one can do that. But one can also look at everyday art, or one can look at ethics, and everyday cosmopolitanism should have its Islamicate counterpart. And one of the people I talk about in this book that was not mentioned, I should just close with her maybe, is Amy Mills, who is an architectural historian from Georgia, but she writes about how difficult it is to find cosmopolitanism in Istanbul today because all the people who gave rise to cosmopolitanism have been extruded from the city. But in fact, there still are residual traces. There are traces, embodiments, performative elements of cosmopolitanism, even in a modern day Istanbul, which seems to be stripped of its minorities, seems to have lost its, if you will, its pluralistic veneer as a cultural capital of not only Turkey, but of the mid-Mediterranean world. So my hope is that Islamicate can be used more familiarly, and not only by students in Chicago, but by people who are interested in seeing the different layers and also colors and elements of Islam in public life.
Thank you so much. So, last one really.
Yeah.
Mm.
So, in the interest of time, we don't have much, time for more questions. Professor Lawrence, you dedicated this book to Albert Hussein. Is that correct?
Albert Hussein,
Albert Hussein.
which is in Southeast Asia means the same thing as Hussein. Hussein is abbreviation of Hussein.
Who is he?
So this is the first time I'm being asked, why do I dedicate the book, or to whom do I dedicate the book? So I think this illustrates the point that I'm trying to make in the book, that there are some people who are nameless heroes. They're people who've done things which are extraordinary, and because they didn't write a big book or they didn't do a famous piece of art. I mean, M.F. Hussein, everyone knows him for his art, and knows Ibn Khaldun for his book. And there are other people I mentioned. Adamani is a great artist. People know her for her artwork. But there's a certain sense in which there's some people whose life is a work of art, and you don't know them because they never produced anything, either a painting or a book or a public testimony that registers how great they are. But this fellow, Albert Hussein, and I'm glad Walter Mignolo is present, because Walter is one of the few people who read my book who remembers Albert. When we had a conference on what was then the theme of Muslim cosmopolitanism in Doha in 2010, we invited two people over from the Philippines. One was a well-known person who was a PhD, or DPhil rather, from Oxford, and whom I quote at length in the book, who's written extensively about rooted cosmopolitanism. But the other was a person who showed me around and introduced me to all these different people, and at one point said, "You're getting in the back of the car and we're pulling up the shades." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because around the corner are people who want to kill you." I took his advice. I was spared that attack. I survived my field work in the Philippines. I was able to go to Doha and have this conference where Professor Mignolo and I were both present with Joel Canaday, who was the other Philippine representative, and different people for this conference. But unfortunately, in the years after that, in the year, I think it was 2014, a couple of years after the conference that we had in Qatar, Albert Hussein was attacked and killed. But he always was talked about as a warrior for the right. He talked about himself as a gunless warrior. And so I think if there's one kind of embodiment of the cosmopolitan and Islamicate, he was a Muslim without any pretense that everybody had to be Muslim, and most of his family was Christian, but he was in his own way, let's say, a quiet but earnest Muslim. So I think of Albert as a kind of embodiment of Islamicate cosmopolitan spirit. That's why I dedicated the book to him. But thank you for the question. You're the first person to ask it.